early days of BOF, we have prided ourselves on connecting fashion with technology and innovation, all the way from Silicon Valley to right here in the UK. And we started out with questions like, what is this new thing called social media going to do? And what are things like mass customization and wearable technology and virtual reality? How are these things going to impact the fashion industry? So today, we're taking that one step further. We're going to take you into the industry's very future and also understand how technology can help us to address some of the key challenges of our time, several of which were raised this morning. This morning, we learned from Ellen MacArthur about embedding the principles of circularity in the very fibers of our industry and engaged in a debate about the treatment of animals in the fur industry. But what if a new technology could address these questions? What if we didn't need animals at all? Andras Forgacs is the founder and CEO of a revolutionary company that we at BOF have been following behind the scenes for several years. And now, for the first time in a public setting at a conference, Andras is here to share the secrets about what his company, Modern Meadow, has been working on, giving us a sneak peek into the future of fashion. Welcome to the era of biofabrication.
Hello, I'm thrilled to be here. Do we have? So as you all know, human civilization has been propelled by advances, innovations in materials. From the Stone Age to the Information Age, or Silicon Age, we've often labeled chapters in human history by the materials we've been able to master. In the Stone Age, this was the first time that humanity was able to take materials from nature and to make our most cherished items. And to this day, some of these natural materials that came from the Stone Age are some of our most cherished materials today. Materials like wood, wool, silk, cotton, and leather. Fast forward to the Industrial Revolution. We could not have had the Industrial Revolution without advances in smelting steel, which led to breakthroughs in making of machinery and construction. And indeed, in the 20th century began with huge advances in synthetic polymers. I mean, think Lycra and nylon. And then the latter half of the 20th century, the Information Age, could not have happened without semiconductors and silicon-based materials. And in the realm of biology, the 20th century saw the breaking of the DNA code, which is the information storage device of life. And that led to huge revolutions in medicine. So it is only fitting that we look to one of the big visionaries of the Information Age to see where the next century may be headed, where the next material breakthroughs may come from. And indeed, Steve Jobs predicted that the big breakthroughs of this century would come at the intersection of biology and technology. Indeed, welcome to the era of biofabrication. So let me ask you in the audience, who here has heard about or knows what biofabrication is? Raise your hands. All right, you're all very well informed. So biofabrication, as it sounds, is actually building with biology, with purpose. It's a discipline that sits at the intersection of biology, engineering, and design. And it is these breakthroughs in material science and biology that have happened over the last several decades which allows us to go back to some of our most ancient materials, materials like wood, wool, silk, and leather, and reinterpret them with this enhanced toolkit powered by human ingenuity. So at Modern Meadow, we're applying biofabrication to reinterpret leather. And how do we do this? We do this by realizing that essentially the main biological ingredient in leather is collagen. It's a protein. And rather than taking it from a sentient animal through a process that is inefficient and has seen fairly little innovation, we can actually use the toolkit of biotechnology to grow this collagen. and then use this collagen as an ingredient to make a whole world of materials through the toolkit of material science. So how we practice biofabrication is by designing organisms that can produce the proteins or the building blocks, which we can then, by growing up these organisms, we can get them to become little biological factories to produce these ingredients, and then we can assemble these ingredients to create a whole new world of materials. Now, importantly, this starts to blur the distinction between what is natural and what is synthetic. There's great advantages to natural materials, there's great advantages to synthetic materials. We believe that biofabrication offers a third category, one that combines the advantages of both. It's what is natural, but enhanced with human creativity. So let's go through the design step, how we do biofabrication. In the case of Modern Meadow, the way we make our biofabricated leather is we start with by engineering the DNA of a yeast organism. And it's not too dissimilar from the yeast that you might use to brew beer. But in this case, instead of eating sugar and producing alcohol, we've made this yeast eat sugar and produced collagen. And so once we've engineered the DNA of yeast, we're able to grow it up in large quantities using brewing or fermentation techniques. And this is an example of the fermentation tanks that we have operating at Modern Meadow, where we want to optimize these fermentations at small scale before we scale it up to very large scale, thousands of liters, tens of thousands of liters, and up. So visualize a brewery making the ingredients of leather in the future rather than livestock. And then finally, we can take collagen from the brewery where it's made and fibrillate this collagen to create the higher order structure that replicates the functionality in leather. And we have a whole bunch of ways of doing this to create actually a range of properties. We can develop materials that are very much similar to leather because they're made of the same stuff as leather, but they can actually explore entirely new design, performance, and functionality. And we do go through a tanning process, but because we don't need to remove hair, flesh, and fat, our tanning process is actually much cleaner, uses lower amounts of chemicals, and more efficient. So the implications of biofabrication are actually quite profound at many levels, for the manufacturer, for the designer, for the consumer, and of course for the planet. So for the manufacturer, all of a sudden you can go from For the manufacturer, all of a sudden you can go from a process that is subtractive to one that is additive. So rather than having to take raise animals in the field and transport them to slaughter and remove their hide and remove the hair, flesh, and fat from that hide, partially tan that material and then ship it halfway around the world, all of a sudden you can grow what you need. You can grow the collagen, you can do it very efficiently using these giant brew tanks, and then you can ship that collagen to where you actually need it to be able to convert it into the materials that you want to make. So it's a completely additive process rather than a highly subtractive one. Also, you take a process that takes years to raise an animal in the field and tens of thousands of miles to ship the animal and then the hides, because typically most animals are raised very far from where most leather is tanned these days. And you can collapse that into less than 2 weeks and much fewer material miles. And in fact, it's about a week to run the fermentation, to run the brewing, and it is about a week or less than a week to convert the collagen into material. So think about that. All of a sudden, you can have a biofabricated leather on demand within less than a week. This can enable lean supply chains and just-in-time manufacturing. For designers, the implications are also quite exciting. Rather than have to work from what you get off the back of an animal and basically salvage usable pieces of it, all of a sudden you can think about taking your design thinking into the material and engineer it to the forms that you want to make. And rather than being limited to just choosing pre-existing materials and working with a fairly limited palette, all of a sudden you can tune the properties of this materials virtually endlessly, because the design and the performance and the functional properties that you can dial in are virtually unlimited. And in fact, you can create zonal properties, you can create variable topographies, you can create all kinds of different physical properties to the material that can be quite exciting from a design point of view. So if you're a designer, you can take your design thinking beyond the product and into the material, which then allows you to have materials that are tailored for products, or materials that show up differently on different products and with different brands. So rather than going into a department store, a mall, and seeing all these different items that are made virtually of the same materials, all of a sudden you can have individuality or differentiation in the materials themselves, not just in the product design. For the consumer, all of a sudden you take an industry which has been fairly opaque. I mean, after all, how many consumers have been invited to visit a slaughterhouse or see how livestock is treated in the final weeks and months of its life? And you can turn it into an experience that's much more akin to a brewery. And in fact, breweries or distilleries are much more inviting environments. So you take a fairly opaque process and you can make it quite transparent. So the way it's made all of a sudden becomes part of what the object is, or part of what the materials are. And importantly, historically, sustainability, it's a very, very powerful concept. It's a great aspiration, but it has been associated with compromise, having to make do with materials that either don't perform as well or are much more expensive. And by biofabricating, all of a sudden we can enable materials that can perform well, that can enable new design possibilities, that can be premium and sustainable. It doesn't become an or, a trade-off. And then, of course, for the planet, rather than we can think beyond the resource limits of this planet. Because after all, livestock is one of the largest users of land, water, and one of the biggest contributors of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we can make leather materials without having to rely on livestock, that's a breakthrough. And of course, rather than making this wonderful material of leather from sentient life, all of a sudden we can make this material with life. And not have to exploit sentient life to do it. So biofabrication is a fairly new concept. It's manifesting itself in leather materials and silk and other materials. But as you can see, there's multiple layers to this. So how do we explain this? What do we call this? This is something we've been wrestling with at Modern Meadow. And people have been asking us for years now, what are you going to call it? And Modern Meadow biofabricated leather materials just doesn't roll off the tongue. So very excited to share with you that this fall, we finally gave our baby a name. And we decided to call it, can we go back? To call it Zoa. Now, why Zoa? Zoa derives from the Greek term zoe, which means life. And you might have heard this term in other words like zoo, or if you've ever talked to a zoologist, or you might have read about or learned about protozoa or hydrozoa or metazoa. It is basically a very powerful concept to be able to celebrate life and to be able to grow materials with life. And so that's very much what we wanted to capture with these materials. Biofabrication is about celebrating life. It also helps that the middle name of my oldest daughter is Zoe. So let me show you examples of Zoa. This is Zoa. And as you can see, it comes in many forms. It's a world of materials. This is an example of Zoa that's made in a sheet form, and it has a natural grain to it. But because we are assembling these materials in entirely new ways, we can also tan it in a liquid form. and we can work with it in a liquid form. So just think about it, liquid leather. So this is an example of ZOA that we've worked with in a liquid form. And if you can work with it in a liquid form, all of a sudden, it enables not just new materials, but new construction possibilities. So this is an example of us taking two different fabrics. So we took a fabric and we cut a circle out of it, and then we took a smaller circle made of a different fabric, and we joined them with ZOA in liquid form. So you can see that here ZOA is integrated with the outer fabric, spans a gap, and then is also integrated with the inner fabric. So it all of a sudden becomes a seam, a way of combining textiles without stitching. And if you can work with it in liquid form, you can assemble items without cutting or gluing. So this is an example of something made out of ZOA, where we didn't cut and we didn't glue. We just worked with ZOA in its liquid form. And if you can work with it in a liquid form, this was a provocation that we did to show that you can actually also spray it on. So this is an example of ZOA that was sprayed onto silk. So think about it, leather as a mist. And one of the other possibilities is that we can create all kinds of patterns and geometries. So here's an example of the natural grain of ZOA combined with a geometrical grain. So all of a sudden, you've got new topographies. And here's an example of ZOA where we show, again, a different topography, and this idea that we can create zonal properties. So the way that the material can behave in one area is different than the way it can behave in another area. So we weren't expecting to unveil ZOA this fall. We were expecting to show up for the first time with partners next year. But then earlier this year, we got a call from Paola Antonelli at the Museum of Modern Art. And she asked if we could make an item that could be included in the Items is Fashion Modern exhibit. And as many of you know, when MoMA decides to do an exhibit on fashion, well, that's a very rare and special moment. They haven't done one in 70 years. So this was an opportunity we couldn't pass up. And when we were looking through the list of what are the items that we could reinterpret, because Paula had asked us to reinterpret an item as a prototype for this exhibit, we wanted to go with an item that you would not typically think of as being made of leather. And we wanted to go with an item that was not strongly associated with another brand. We wanted it to be a provocation of what are the new things you can do with a new material. So we picked the graphic tee, the graphic T-shirt, which, as many of you know, is the blank canvas of fashion, and it's also the garment of revolutionaries. So we very much wanted to embrace this idea that this is indeed a material revolution. So you can see this T-shirt was made with ZOA, and what we did is we took a simple T-shirt, we took it apart into pieces, and we used ZOA in its liquid form to reassemble the pieces and actually substituted cotton with mesh in a few areas. So you can see this is another example of not just ZOA working as a new material, but as a new way of manufacturing. This T-shirt was reassembled without any stitching by having ZOA work in its liquid form. And then we also did a pop-up in Soho as an exhibit to show some of the design possibilities around ZOA in its liquid form. And this is something we intend to continue to educate the public about what biofabrication is and what are the design possibilities it can enable. And in fact, if any of you are in New York next week, our Chief Creative Officer, Suzanne Lee, is organizing the Biofabricate conference, which is a conference that brings together designers and researchers and industry to explore biofabrication. So I wanted to share with you the video that accompanied the MoMA exhibit to explain this idea, this provocation. Thank you. Thank you. So I look forward to talking with each of you and exploring what we can grow together. Thank you.
Thanks, Andras. As you know, we've been at BOF stalking you for like a few years, trying to figure out exactly what you guys have been up to. So I'm really grateful you took the time. I had one question, which is, as you think about the properties of ZOA versus the properties of a leather that's procured from an animal, what are the differences? You know, you've talked about how they can kind of perform similar functional purpose in a product and in design.
Yeah.
But how are they different?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. We have a lot of design space. I mean, a virtually limitless design space with ZOA. And actually, one of the challenges for us is to figure out what to focus on first. With traditional leather, it's a wonderful material, and it's a material we love very much. We've deliberately decided not to be in the realm of imitation. We don't want ZOA to be imitative. We want it to be innovative. We want it to take what is familiar and what we love about leather, but to build on that, to go beyond that. So there's not one property that I can highlight for ZOA that would differentiate it. It'll be ultimately dozens and dozens of properties depending on what we dial in. Because ZOA is not just one material. It's ultimately going to be dozens and hundreds of materials. Because with each collaboration with a different brand, a different designer, we can dial in ZOA to show up differently. So it might be that
so it's like an app store.
It's an operating system to create new materials. An operating system where you have tremendous control over design, performance, and functionality. You can make materials that are impossibly thin and strong. You can make them thicker. You can vary the topography. You can create zonal properties. You can make it stiffer, soft, more elastic. I mean, we're just really starting to scratch the surface of what it can do. And it actually takes a good amount of time in the beginning to dial it in, because the very first time you show up in the world, you want to make sure it's at a very high standard. Mm-hmm. And the partners that we're working with are some of the best of the best. So we're working carefully to dial in the properties to make sure that the first time ZOA shows up, sometime next year, it can speak to what is desirable and wonderful about leather, but at the same time highlight something that is visibly differentiated from it.
Okay, well, we look forward to next year when these mysterious partners are going to be revealed. But thank you very, very much for sharing your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you.